I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet. Langston Hughes' famous indictment of one of the most promising of the Negro poets, in which he makes the rather bold claim that the young artist simply wants to be white through his method of poetry, acted as a catalyst for the rest of his essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. Unfortunately, in dismissing Countee Cullen as holding this single view, he failed to see the mountain of meaning behind his actual verse. Born in Louisville, Kentucky, in March of 1903, Countee Leroy Porter was raised by his grandmother until he was 15. After she passed on, he was adopted by Reverend Frederick Asbury Cullen, the pastor of Salem Methodist Episcopal Church, Harlem's largest congregation. As a result, he spent his youth in the very heart of the Harlem Renaissance, the center of black activism and achievement. And he was well suited for it. As early as high school, Countee was writing poetry and entering contests. His poetry continued into his attendance at New York University, where he won second prize in the nationwide Witter Bynner Poetry Contest with his first major poem, The Ballad of the Brown Girl. After he graduated from NYU in 1925, he began acting as assistant editor for the magazine Opportunity, in which he also wrote the column The Dark Tower. In it, he encouraged his philosophy on his readers, calling on African American writers to create representative and respectable race literature, while insisting they not bind themselves to the race or restrict their writing only to racial themes. It was during this period of 1925 to 1928 that he could be considered the most successful both in life and in his work. Over the course of 4 years, he published several volumes of poetry, including Color, which established him with a strong connection towards his spiritual upbringing. He published 2 collections of entirely his own poetry, Brown Girl and Copper Sun, and he edited Caroling Dusk, an anthology of black poetry. In 1928, he won a Guggenheim Fellowship to write poetry in France, and in the same year he married Yolande Du Bois, daughter of W.E.B. Du Bois. Their wedding was treated as the social event of the decade, and their tour of France was as much a honeymoon as a new step in Contee's career. However, their marriage was not meant to last, and after only 2 years in 1930, she sued for divorce amidst allegations of Contee's preference for men. Around this time would mark the beginning of Contee's decline as a poet. As prolific as he was, Countee Cullen's staunch romanticism raised doubts among his peers. He was criticized for his elitist attitude towards racial matters, and for ignoring social protest, and particularly for his prescriptions in the Dark Tower for artists to avoid, quote, some things, some truths of Negro life and thought that all Negroes know but take no pride in, unquote. With his educational influences consisting of mostly white, romantic poets, such as John Keats, and his staunch, almost uncreative adherence to more traditional forms of verse, it's understandable that he'd come under criticism for his attitude. Going a little deeper into his philosophy, though, shows something much different. So in regards to Langston Hughes' criticism, what did Countee Cullen actually say? He said, "If I'm going to be a poet at all, I'm going to be a poet and not a Negro poet. This is what has hindered the development of artists among us. Their one note has been the concern with their race. That is all very well. None of us can get away from it. I cannot at times. You will see it in my verse. The consciousness of this is too poignant at times. I cannot escape it. But what I mean is this. I shall not write of Negro subjects for the purpose of propaganda. This is not what a poet is concerned with. Of course, when the emotion rising out of the fact that I am a Negro is strong, I express it. But that is another matter." Countee Cullen was as appalled by institutional racism as any of the other writers of his day, and this shone through brightly in his work despite its style being so similar to the style of traditionally white poets. Poems like Heritage, which expresses a recognition of his roots in Africa and an indifference towards them at the same time, presents a strong sense of the dual-mindedness experienced by so many black artists, that desire to claim their own unique culture while still establishing themselves as American citizens. Another example is the poem Yet Do I Marvel, in which Cullen both accepts the Christian God and questions him, saying, "Yet do I marvel that he would make a poet black and bid him sing." Countee Cullen aimed to use his traditional verse to prove that race had no bearing on poetry or quality, and that it should also have no bearing on the treatment of others. Unfortunately, Cullen's idealism about building a bridge of poetry between the two cultures was sorely tested by the end of the 20s. His unchanging style and voice, which originally endeared him to both black and white readers of all literate classes, soon came across as uninteresting and uncreative. And the critics of the day, so enthused with the dramatic, organic nature of other poets' voices, passed Countee Cullen by. But the young poet had no intentions of giving up. For a few years, he attempted longer literature, writing the novel One Way to Heaven, which was in many ways a response to the exact type of work he'd spoken against in his Dark Tower column. It was poorly received, however, and for the next several years he explored playwriting and translating and children's literature, and was even offered several tenured professorships at universities around the state. But Cullen rejected them and settled down as a French and English teacher at Frederick Douglass Junior High School in 1934. He held this position until his death 2 years later, when complications with blood pressure took his life. This wasn't before he acted as an inspiration for yet another powerful literary voice, his student, and future essayist and novelist James Baldwin. Despite his apparent decline at the time, Countee Cullen's work has endured, and he shot down Hugh's prophecy that any artist who just wanted to be a poet, not a Negro poet, would ultimately fade away. In 2013, he was inducted into the New York Writers Hall of Fame, and his verse is still used to inspire young artists today. In short, Countee Cullen took it on himself to prove that he could play by the same rules as white poets and do just as well. And in doing so, he created an enduring legacy, which stands as evidence that there are many different ways for an artist to conquer that racial mountain. In Countee Cullen's case, he did it with style.